Welcome, Life Sciences, to another exciting life science lesson. Today we're going to talk a lot about plants. And I know a lot of you, I know the kids in my class, they roll their eyes when they get to do plants. But plants are so awesome because you can go outside and you can see things and you can touch them and you can look at them. So it's actually a really hands-on part. Okay, so what we're going to look at, let me try and get it for you in a nutshell. We're looking at plant diversity. Now, when we're looking, we're not going to look particularly at specific plants. Well, we are going to in a way, but what we're going to look at is how plants have changed over time. So if we will use the word evolution, that would be one of our key terms here to see how plants have changed or evolved over time. Okay, so let's have a look at a few of our key concepts. Now, the one question that I've put over here is that plants, you might have done the section on microorganisms where we looked at the kingdom called protists. And protists had two little branches to them. And the one branch went to the animal kingdom and the other branch went to plant-like. And I use the word plant-like because they weren't plants. We called them algae. So what they could do was they could photosynthesize, but they didn't have the roots, the stems, the leaves, the kind of tissues and certain characteristics that we're going to have a look at when we're talking about plants. So what we're going to look at, what we're going to focus on now is we're moving from the water, where we looked at algae, and we're now going to look at how plants start to adapt to live on land. Okay? That's what plants do. They are terrestrial. Yes, some plants are able to live in water, but we're generally looking at the concept of moving from an aquatic environment to a terrestrial environment. When we look at our concept map over here, you're going to see these are what we're going to look at. And they're going to be some very big terms. If you have a look on the board here, you're going to see we're going to have a look at words that you might not recognize. For example, phylogenetic. These are all going to be new terms to you. And all these words over here, bryophyta, pteridophyta, gymnosperms, and angiosperms. Okay, what are we going to look at? We're going to take plants and we're going to put them into certain categories depending on certain criteria that we must use. Okay, so I'm not going to go through those keywords. You will see there are keywords on there as I go through the PowerPoint, as we go through the presentation. Then you're going to see I'm going to pop those keywords in. And if you need to later, you can go through those keywords and just make sure you understand what they mean. Okay, let's have a look at the chart on the board here. Okay, guys, so we're looking at plants, right? This is what we're looking at. We're looking at the kingdom. Now, remember when we did microorganisms, we said that we looked at certain kingdoms, classification. Plants belong to the kingdom, all right, Plantae. Now, what we're going to look at is the following. We are going to look at 4 major groups of plants. Now, as you can see here, there might be words that you have not used before, and I use the word groups because that's exactly what they're going to be, right? So we're going to look at a specific group, and they belong to that specific group because they've got those specific categories, or they're missing something, or they have these kind of characteristics. And what I've done is I've put a picture underneath each of them of a plant, an example of a plant that we are going to look at in a little bit more detail to explain what do we mean about that characteristic. Okay, so the 4 groups of major plants that we are going to look at are as follows. We're going to look at bryophyte, okay, and there's a few plants that belong to that group, but we're going to pay particular attention to moss. If the season's very rainy, maybe you guys can go and check on your pavements or around your taps. You're going to find these, it almost looks like grass, but it's not. We're going to look at moss. They're going to be the most simplest plants. Then we're going to look at the next group. And as I said, we're going to look at the different criteria behind them. This group, it's like a silent P, is called pteridophyta. And these pteridophytes, but there's lots of little groups that belong to it. But we're going to pay particular attention to ferns. And I want you to see if you're walking to school or if you're walking around in the veld or if you maybe have a garden, etc. I want to see if you can identify what these are. Our next group are called gymnosperms. And gymnosperm basically means naked seed, and we're going to see why later that is called. But this belongs to the group that have cones. Right, can you see here? There's a few different kinds of plants, and we're going to just look at specifically at the pine tree. Then the last group of plants that we're going to look at is called angiosperms. And angiosperms are any plant that produces a flower. Okay, so we're taking our plant kingdom and we're going to divide it into the 4 groups. And we're going to look at the specifics of what is in that 4 groups. Now, when we look at plants, you need to understand that there's an evolution towards them. What do I mean by that? Some plants appear earlier in the evolutionary time scale, and over time, these different groups that I've showed to you appear at later stages. So if we look at these 4 groups, I could make this could almost be a timeline. So what do I mean by that? These would be your earlier plants, and these would be, right, your newest. So earlier or oldest and the newest plants. Now when we look at the plant kingdom, what are we looking at? Okay. Now, I said to you, we're going to take certain criteria and we're going to group the plants into that criteria. So what's the first thing we look at? The first thing we look at is plants, the common ancestor. What I meant by common ancestor is plants, they originated from algae, okay, from in the water, aquatic. And then plants, we saw later on that they were able to develop certain characteristics that enabled them to live on land. Now, have a look at this. What we're looking at is as follows. So we have the simple green algae, which is not a plant, it's a protist. But now, when we look at plants, when we start with the plant kingdom, we divide it into 2 categories. Now, there is the follows. Plants that have vascular tissue. Now, I don't know if you remember in maybe previous modules that you might have done, when you looked at plant tissue called xylem and phloem, and I don't know if you can remember, but they were long, thin structures. Xylem carried water up the stem. It looks like a straw. And phloem, generally, they had like these sieve plates. They carried food in a general direction down, right? This was phloem over here. Now, those tissues were like quite complex tissues. And when we come from the water onto land, xylem and phloem don't exist yet. So our first group of plants is very simple. They don't have any xylem or phloem. And this is the group that we start off with, the moss, the bryophyte. Now, because they can't have any xylem phloem, they can't get big, they can't transport water. Right, so when you go look for moss, it forms like a very tiny, small, right, because they can't transport water, so the water just puddles over them and they absorb the water by diffusion. They can't get nice and big, but they can grow on everything. Look here, it's growing on rock. That is important because when the earth developed, there wasn't soil, there was rock. And that moss, because it didn't have roots, can grow on anything. It grows on the rocks, And what does it do to the rocks? It breaks the rocks down by weathering. And when we break the rocks down, we get soil. And when I get soil, then I can, all right, bigger plants can then grow. You might have a look at it later on in the modules. You're going to look at something called ecological succession, but we're going to keep that for a long time. Okay, guys, so what we're looking at here, right, is we've got plants that had vascular tissue and plants that didn't, right? So because they had no vascular tissue, they belong to the bryophytes. Okay, that is moss. Now we go to the other side. Plants that have vascular tissue. Remember, we've got two choices here. Now, this group is now divided. So I've got these groups have got xylem and phloem. So they belong to a different group, but they do not make a seed. They make a spore. Now, a seed is quite a special thing, and that's only going to come a little bit later. So we're going to look at, all right, a plant that has xylem and phloem, so it can get bigger, right? The leaves can get bigger. It has stems. It has roots, right? But it's still, when it reproduces, it reproduces by a spore and not a seed. There's a difference between the two. There's a difference between a spore and there's a difference between a seed. Now, I want you to have a look. Maybe you've seen these, right, at the bottom of ferns on their leaf. Those are called sori, right? And what they've got in, they've got spores. And when those burst open, new fern plants, all right, are going to emerge from that. But they're still, all right, still vascular. They can grow quite big, but they're produced by spores. Okay, so we've got the vascular, okay, spore, seedless, and now seeds. Now let's have a look at this one. Now what happens is, what happens if I produce a seed, right? So remember, it was vascular, but it was seedless. That was my fern, my pteridophyte. What do I call plants that produce seeds? Seeds are hardy, right? They got like this coat around them, and they can be protected, and they're much more resilient on land, all right? They're hardy on land than, all right, the spores are going to be. So let's have a look here. We've got two groups that fall into the seed bearing. One group is called gymnosperms, and as I say to you, gymnosperm means a naked seed. What do I mean by naked seed? I'm saying that the seed, and we're going to look at it just now, is found on the pine cone here. We're going to look at anything that produces a pine cone. Then the other group of seed-bearing plants are going to be these beautiful flowers. Now this over here is an apple blossom. It's a flower that is going to become, right, fruit. And some angiosperms, look at their seeds, nice and hard, find it in the apple over here, okay? And you're going to find that some of the angiosperms, they are going to be able to produce fruit. So their flower, all right, and is going to become the fruit. They're going to attract the pollinators. It becomes a fruit inside there. And what's inside the fruit? The seeds, protected inside, rather than the naked seeds out on the cone that it might not be as safe. So what you're looking at, as we look at the plants over time, so we start to see how they adapt features that make them far more resilient, all right, or far more hardy to live on land, right? So to become less dependent on water. That's what we want to do. We don't want to dry out, but we don't want to be totally dependent on water. Okay, now it's a bit of a difficult term that we're going to look at. When we look at the plants in the 4 different groups, I'm going to just give you a general terminology, what we use. Okay, so what we have is the following. When we look at the plants, we're going to find 2 generations. And what we mean by that is it's going to become a bit more clearer when we look at the plants themselves. But what it means is the following. Okay, when we look at the plants, we're going to see that there are, when we look at 2 generations, we're going to see that one generation, right, is called the gametophyte generation. And what that means is this gametophyte produces gametes. And a gamete is a sex cell, all right? And those 2 gametes, if I've got a male and a female, right, say I've got an egg and a sperm, if they fuse, the gametes fuse, all right, they make a sporophyte generation. And what does a sporophyte generation do? That is the generation that makes spores or seeds. Those seeds fall to the ground, and what do they give rise to? A gametophyte generation. The gametophyte has gametes, the gametes fuse, and we have a sporophyte. So it's this continuous cycle of what is the gametophyte of the plant and which is the sporophyte of the plant. All right, where does the emphasis lie? And for each of our plants, we're going to see which generation, all right, the gametophyte or the sporophyte, which of that generation is my dominant generation. Okay, which one? I won't say dominant as in plays a better role, but it's the more dominant of the structures that we are going to look at. Okay, guys, we're going to start off, before we have a break, looking at our moss plant. Okay, so when we look at moss, right, I've done a picture over here. You've got to have the picture in your head. I want you to understand, we looked earlier, moss can't grow very big. There's no vascular tissue. It's totally reliant on water. Now, if you can remember on your module when we looked at leaves, leaves have a cuticle, like a waxy substance over them, so that we can't lose water and we can't absorb water because we need to get it from the roots. Moss doesn't have that. A single layer of cells that water can just diffuse in. We're small, we've just basically, right, our common ancestors are from the water, so we can't go from water to wow, wham, bam, go to land. We've got to take things slowly, step slowly. So I'm very small. I need water, all right? I don't have a cuticle. The water comes in, all right, by diffusion. I don't have these roots or stems or leaves. I have stem-like structures or root-like structures, right? And when I get to the plant, my dominant generation is a gametophyte. Now I want you to have a look at the moss. This is the diagram that you'll need to be able to study and learn. Now, if we look at moss over here, you'll see over here is a gametophyte, and a gametophyte means it produces gametes. And you won't believe it, but underneath the leaves here, there's a male leaf and there's a female leaf. And you know what? There's the female egg and there's the male sperm. And they need water. And when the water rushes over, the sperm swims to the female and they fuse. And when they fuse, right, they produce, this is N and N because they're haploid, they produce the stalk. Now have a look, it's not green. It's like almost like parasitic. And it's a seta, it's not a stem. And what it does is inside here, there's a capsule. And the capsule hangs and it's got teeth, right, like on the inside over here. So you've got something that's hanging and it's got like these teeth that cover. And when it gets slightly drier, when the environment is not as moist, those teeth dry out and they separate. And inside of here, what do you think is in here? Inside of here, we're going to find spores. Why are we going to find spores? Because this is the sporophyte of the plant. This is the only plant group that the gametophyte is the main generation. All our other ones we're going to see otherwise. So inside here, we're going to have spores, right? A process called meiosis occurs, which you will look at a much later stage. And these spores then fall to the ground. And when they fall to the ground, what are they going to do? They're going to make a new moss plant. So this is the gametophyte generation, and that is the sporophyte generation. Okay, now we're going to look at ferns. Now they are slightly one step up, so they're kind of like, I don't know if you've ever, and I think most of you might not know if you go and buy a car, all right? Sometimes you can buy a car and it's got nothing in it, all right? No electric windows, all right? No power steering, no ABS brakes, there's no radio, right? You can buy the basic car, and then you can add a feature onto it. So here, this is what we're basically doing. The moss is like your base model, right? That is it. It's as simple as you come. Now we say, okay, let's put, all right, electric windows into it. Okay, so now it's not the same as the base model. It's got something that just makes it a little bit easier. And that is what ferns have got. Ferns now have got xylem and they've got phloem. So what can I do? Xylem and phloem are able to transport water, so I can get quite big. And also because of that, I can have a cuticle on my leaves. I can have leaves. I actually have a stem. I have roots. Now, if you have a look here at this diagram, you can see this is its stem, and it's under the ground. And this is its roots. All the things that you see above the ground, that is the frond, what we call a leaf. Now I want you to have a look at something. I don't think you ever really see it because it disappears. When a fern is a baby, it consists of this little heart. It's tiny. It's called the gametophyte. And on the gametophyte is male and female. Okay, let me put the male on that side. And what do the male and the female do? There's the egg. And what does the sperm do? It swims, all right? And then they fuse. And when they fuse, guess what's going to start to grow out from the top? The leaves are going to start to grow, and the roots are going to start to grow. And as soon as that grows, you know what happens to this guy? He's tiny. He disappears. He shrivels up. There's the gametophyte. He shrivels up, and he dies. He dies. He's done his thing. Male and female, they've now fused, and what do we have? This beautiful whole plant is the sporophyte generation. And the sporophyte generation, all right, is the major generation. Now have a look. This guy can get quite big. Yes, he relies on water, right? He relies on water for the sperm to swim to the female underneath on the soil. But we're starting to see a plant that, although needs water, is not as reliant on water and can stay in places a little bit drier than our moss can. So it's got, what has it got? It's got vascular tissue, yes, but how does it reproduce? Have a look. What are these things that I said to you? These are called sori. And what does a sporophyte produce? Spores. And these spores are going to fall to the ground. And when they fall to the ground, what are they going to make? This little, it looks like a heart. That's why it's called a heart-shaped prothallus. But it's the gametophyte. And they're going to reproduce, and it's going to give rise to the sporophyte plant. Okay, guys, we're going to take a quick break. That was a lot to take in. We'll be back shortly.